Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. U.S. History Edition, I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic, the second half of our lecture on the 1990s and the rise of neoliberalism. Now, as always, take a quick moment, hit pause on your video, jot down the rest of the outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms on the left. Now, with that, let's get started. Now, when we left off, we were discussing the beginnings of Clinton's first term and trying to illustrate just how far things have shifted to the right politically. And of course, Clinton was very concerned with the economy. We've been in a very long recession, and with some tax reform, with NAFTA, in the short term, things begin to steady itself, the economy that is, and begin to rebound. He also offered some token legislation for the gay community with Don't Ask, Don't Tell. But in both of these things, you can really see how conservatism is sneaking its way in with the backlash against the thought of allowing gays to openly serve in the military. This is a trend that will continue into the rest of Clinton's terms. Now, one of his other big issues besides the economy, he was concerned with crime throughout our country. And he focused on a couple of main issues. One was gun control, and the second one was criminal justice reform. Now, in Clinton's first term, there would have been a couple of interesting developments when it came to crime. On the one hand, there was a rise in what was called the militia movement. In other words, there was a burgeoning militia, they call themselves patriots, that had been spreading across our country in the early 1990s. Now, this movement was basically representing a paranoid populist strain in America. And basically, again, this is a populist movement. It's a grassroots movement that basically had this deep paranoia and deep mistrust in the American government. Gee, I wonder where that came from. LBJ, Vietnam, protests, Nixon, Watergate. All these things convinced some Americans that the government may not have their best interests at heart anymore. And they begin to arm themselves and form these militia groups as a way to defend themselves. Remember, Second Amendment rights. In 1993, during his first term, Clinton was going to sign what's called the Brady Bill. Now, the Brady Bill mandated federal background checks on firearm purchases and a 5-day waiting period if you want to purchase a firearm. Now, are these really that radical of steps in, they're taking away my guns? Well, no, they're not. There's a 5-day waiting period, and you have a federal background check to ensure you're not crazy or on someone's watch list. Well, of course, these patriots, these militia groups, were convinced this was the federal government conspiring to take away their Second Amendment rights, the right to bear arms. And this only increased not only their numbers, but also their aggressive nature and action. So, for example, a couple examples of this. In the West, militias actually challenged federal control of public lands. They refused to pay taxes. They even threatened to kill local government officials and judges. So this is out in Oregon and Washington State. They actually took over a federal park and had a standoff there. And of course, the big one was in 1993 here in Texas. There was a standoff between federal agents and a group that called themselves the Branch Davidians. They were an apocalyptic militia group, so combining religion with this militia movement, right here in Waco, Texas. Now, the issue here was they had been stockpiling weapons and they were deemed to be a legitimate threat to the country. And so federal agents were going to go into them, arrest them, confiscate the weapons, and if there were any, criminal issues, put them on trial for it. Well, as they began to try to enter the compound, they were met with open gunfire from the Branch Davidians, led by David Koresh. And again, if you want to watch there's a great Netflix series on this. Watch it. It's a great series on this whole documentary on what happened in Waco, Texas. Now, I remember this as a kid watching this at school. And just in awe is for the next 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 50 days, almost 2 months, I was trying to say, there was a standoff between the Branch Davidians in the compound and these government officials, federal agents, alcohol, tobacco, firearm, ATF. There were small tanks there. This was a big, big standoff that went on for weeks on end and captivated the nation. And again, there on the one hand, propaganda said these guys were crazy, that they were some cult that just wanted to have sex all the time, and maybe that partly did happen. But a lot of this was in response to they felt the government was out to get them. They wanted to prepare for the apocalypse, that they felt the government would take over. Now, in the end, in the original battle, 4 agents and 2 Branch Davidians were killed. Now, after 50 days, the FBI began to attack the compound with armored vehicles and tear gas. Now, what happened next was the compound caught on fire, and at least 77 people died in the inferno. This was a major catastrophe. And it was something that the militia movement remembered, because just 2 years later, on the 2nd anniversary of the Waco incident, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, both members of a right-wing militia group, bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, killing 168 people. Again, there was definite discontent in our nation. And I remember the Oklahoma City bombing quite well. I remember my dad afterwards saying, I hope we go find who did this and bomb their country. Okay, he's being a little extreme, yes. And then we found out that Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols were not some foreign terrorist group. They were militia members from Michigan, about less than an hour from where I live and grew up. Again, there's definite discontent in this ultra-right-wing conservative side of things. That was one side of the criminal justice issue, and he was dealing with gun control. The second big issue he dealt with was with actual criminal justice reform. In this case, the crime bill. Now, the official name is the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. Now, again, short name, the crime bill. And this was a movement because it was perceived that there was an epidemic in our country of violent crime. And so in 1994, among many pieces of legislation passed, there was the crime bill. Now, I want you to know this did a number of good things and some bad things. And so you see on your screen, it provided 100,000 new police officers to help patrol the streets, to help put down crime. It also added $9.7 billion for prisons and new prisons. Now, some have argued this is a bad thing because you're putting more people in prison, which, again, theoretically, this was needed because the next thing, they increased mandatory minimum sentences, even for minor crimes. And so they took the theory here was, of course, if you impose stiffer penalties, maybe it'll deter people from actually doing these crimes. And then, of course, you see the last thing, it also expanded the use of the death penalty, which is usually a betrayal of liberalism. Again, he's a new Democrat. He compromises with the Republicans on this. It also did a couple other good things. It also provided over $1 billion to prevent and investigate rape cases and domestic assault for women. So again, you can argue the death penalty back and forth. You can argue whether or not more prisons or expanding prisons was a good thing or not. But more police officers, fine. Money for investigating and preventing rape, fantastic. The other thing it did, it actually instituted what was called the 3 strikes policy that basically mandated life in prison if you were after 3 strikes of either violent or drug felonies. That in itself is not the worst thing. Again, it's this idea of this deterrent. This is the harsher crime, harsher punishment now if you do the crime. Again, theoretically, it's not the worst thing in the world. What is a problem is how it's implemented. This is really important, guys, because those 100,000 new police officers, this expanded, 3 strikes language, this expansion of prisons, it's all fine and well theoretically. The problem is we have all this violent crime in our country, supposedly. That's why we're passing this law. Where do you think most of the crime comes from? I'll give you a second to think about that. where would you assume it comes from? Does it come from Wall Street? Does it come from Main Street? Does it come from those urban barrios, ghettos, ethnic neighborhoods? Now, you've been with me long enough, you've read enough books in this class and know enough history at this point. There's a tendency to assume that the most amount of crime occurs in neighborhoods that are lower socioeconomic places. It's just a fact. That's how people think and stereotype. Now, is there crime there? Sure. Is there crime maybe caused by the fact that they lack resources, money, housing, stability? Sure. But here's the thing. You can find crime wherever you look. Let me give you a story. There's a great story in a book I read about Mayor Rudy Giuliani. Now, this is back in the 1990s when he was mayor of New York City. He, on one night, decided he would go with the police to go on a drug sting bust. So they're going to go out and try to buy some drugs from a dealer, and they're going to bust him on a sting operation and throw him in jail. So they go down to the ghetto in New York City, and sure enough, they find a young Dominican African-American. He's a mixed race person of color. And sure enough, they bust him for selling crack cocaine. And Rudy Giuliani says, hey, good job. Both you guys and, of course, me too, because it's my idea. And a reporter asked him saying, sir, good job. Question for you, though. You went looking for that drug dealer in the ghetto. And yes, you found him. But couldn't you just have easily, instead of going into downtown to the ghetto, couldn't you just have easily have went uptown and to one of those sky-rise penthouses that houses some wealthy white person? And no, you probably wouldn't have found a crack dealer, but you would have found them snorting cocaine. Because, cocaine is the drug choice of the rich, crack is the choice of the poorer people. And that brings up a really profound idea. In other words, you find crime where you look for it. So these police officers begin choosing to go and over-police ethnic minority, racial minority neighborhoods, lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, often people of color. And there's been studies on this. The results of this are, I have a slide for you. Look at this slide. This tells you and compares Latinos to African Americans to whites. Look at the stats here. If you're a white man, there's a 1 in 17 chance you will likely end in prison. For a white woman, 1 out of 111 chance. But if you're a black man, there's a 1 in 3 chance. If you're a Latino man, a 1 in 6 chance. If you're a black woman, a 1 in 18, and of course, Latino woman, 1 in 45. Those are very sobering statistics, especially for African Americans. But even Latinos, you're talking a 1 in 3 chance if you're a black man that you will likely end up in prison. This is just solely the result of the crime bill. But it does show you the over-policing based on the assumption that more crime will be committed. Now, if this does not convince you of this, of why we have an over-policing problem in persons of color neighborhoods, lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. Look at this slide. This is the war on drugs that began under Nancy Reagan in the Reagan administration in the 1980s. This war on just say no to drugs. So they've increased what's called a 5-year prison sentence for drug ownership or getting caught with drugs on your body. So if you have 500 grams of powder cocaine, that's worth a 5-year prison sentence. The same 5-year prison sentence, though, will also be administered if you're caught with just 5 grams, not 500 grams, 5 grams of crack cocaine. Now, let's compare these two charts now. Who do you think, which demographic is the group that will be snorting the powder cocaine? Whites. Cocaine is a choice of white people and more affluent, wealthier people. So it takes the ownership or possession of 500 grams of cocaine. But the drug of choice for African American and Latinos, because it's cheaper, and again, lower socioeconomic, stereotypically, statistically, just 5 grams, just 5 little grams of crack gives you a 5-year prison sentence. So you combine the prison sentence issue here, this is just one example, with the over-policing that is done as a result of the crime bill, thanks to new police officers, expanded prisons, the 3 strikes language, and thus you get this chart, where if you are a black person or Latino person, there's a far greater chance that you will end up in prison than if you're a white person, especially white women. Basically just assume you won't commit crime. So again, it all goes back to you will find what you're looking for where you're looking for it. So if you're a police officer and you are thinking, crime must be in the lower socioeconomic category, I'll go look for it there. You're going to find it there. But you could just easily go uptown to the rich neighborhoods and find crime there as well. And so ultimately this becomes a huge issue because even though, again, I don't believe Clinton intended this, but the way it was implemented, the way it played out was extremely detrimental to both African Americans and Latinos. And sure enough, the number of people behind bars for nonviolent drug crimes, i.e. possession of cocaine or crack, flew from 50,000 in 1980 to all the way to 400,000. Yeah, from 50,000 to 400,000 between 1980 and 1997. And of course, who it affects disproportionately is African Americans and Latinos because cocaine is not their drug choice. Cocaine is the drug choice of rich, affluent Wall Streeters. Now, how does this play out now in real life now? So that's just statistics. Those are charts. Again, this happened the year before all these stats came out, a couple years before the crime bill actually was implemented. But to give you an example of what this over-policing can do. And of course, the issue is in Los Angeles, Rodney King. Now, in 1991, I know the dates of 1992 on your screen, but 1991, just as you have a lot of these activists fighting against the over-policing in these ethnic or racial minority neighborhoods. This is how the over-policing exacerbates these problems. In 1991, the police decide they're going to pull over an African-American taxi driver by the name of Rodney King. He was intoxicated, and he was afraid that if he got another DUI, he would be thrown in prison because he was out on parole. Now, he was wrong here. He was on parole. He was under the influence. He was intoxicated. And because he knew he'd be thrown back in jail possibly for a long time or life, he took the police on a high-speed chase and was trying to flee them. Again, this is all wrong. Again, he's wrong. He probably deserved to go to jail here. The police who see the streets of Los Angeles go on this police chase with helicopters included. And when they finally capture Rodney King, they pull him over, they get him out of his car, and you see on the left of your screen, they begin to beat him, kick him, stomp him. The thing is, this was normal. This was a common occurrence, especially in these big metropolitan areas like Detroit, like Chicago, like LA. This was common for police to use more brutal tactics. Now again, not this extreme. I'm saying all police were bad like this. Don't get me wrong. This was all too common for black communities or Latino communities. What made this one different, though, was someone caught it on tape. Someone recorded the incident, which is why you see the surveillance camera there. And this person took this tape, this videotape, and sent it to the media, which was played in every major national news outlet, shocking the American public. Like, wait, seriously, this happens? And so these 4 Police officers were indicted. They were put on trial for beating Rodney King. In 1992, see the year there, the jury acquitted 3 of them and could not agree on the charge for the 4th one. So all 4 got off scot-free. And Los Angeles erupted into a race riot. 53 people dead, over almost 2,400 injured, 7,000 fires, and nearly $1 billion in financial losses. It took the Army, Marine, and National Guard to quell the violence and to restore order in Los Angeles. And by the way, there will be several other smaller riots in other cities across the nation. Again, this is pent-up frustration over the over-policing. Well, let me reset the situation for a minute for you. So you have the situation now where you have the crime bill. You have this militia movement against gun control. You have this don't ask, don't tell policy that created this backlash of biblical proportions. And even though most of what Clinton did was pretty conservative, it was a compromise in almost every case, Americans responded with a monumental conservative backlash. And in the 1994 midterm election, this more conservative Republicans were elected and took over both houses of Congress for the first time since 1952. So 1994 was the first time that Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate for the first time since 1952. And the leader of the House, Newt Gingrich, offered what he called the Contract with America. And basically, this was a 10-point policy that called for dismantling the welfare state, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and balancing the budget. And again, I'm going to give Clinton credit here, because Clinton was faced with something really bad here. Remember, he doesn't have both houses, or doesn't have the House or the Senate here. He's really alone here as a new Democrat. And Clinton was smart here. And he's going to compromise with Republicans. Now, he's going to piss off the old guard liberals of the Democratic Party. He's going to tick them off royally. So what Clinton does is, rather than get Newt Gingrich to take control and actually implement the Contract with America, instead Clinton co-opts it. Let me give an example. So as a new Democrat, he said, you know what? I agree with you on some welfare reform. Now, we're not going to dismantle the New Deal state, because that's still good. We like social safety. We like Medicare and Medicaid. We like those things. But as a new Democrat, he's more conservative on fiscal issues. And so he agreed with parts of their thing. He took it and made it his own. So one example of this was in 1996, he signs the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. What is this? He turns over the federal welfare programs for like food stamps, and he turns it over to the states. So he takes it from the federal government, gives it to the states, and basically it limits the amount of time a person can receive federally funded welfare benefits. It basically emphasizes that, it's important people get back to work, which sounds good theoretically. In fact, Clinton says that this is the, quote, end of welfare as we know it, unquote. Later on, he said, quote, the era of big government is over. The era of big government is over, unquote. Again, this was and still is considered a major betrayal of liberal principles. Remember, some people just can't find work. It's not just they don't want to, they can't. And this hurt their families. But it does show how far the Democratic Party moved to the center, or even to the right of center now, because of the shifting of the political parties, thanks to the Reagan Revolution. A second area was very conservative reaction. Now, despite the don't ask, don't tell, in 1996, there was another major backlash against gay rights, specifically the idea of gay marriage. Now, in 1993, the Supreme Court of Hawaii had ruled that states must show a compelling interest to ban gays from getting married. Now, does this mean that gays get married in Hawaii? No. It just means that the Supreme Court is not sure it's constitutionally allowed to ban gay marriage, and therefore states must present a valid cause to do so. Well, of course, people around the country began to yell, "The sky is falling." And this created another backlash of biblical proportions, again, pun intended. And it spooked the religious right so much that conservatives began to work on a constitutional amendment that would ban gay marriage. Now, to prevent a federal amendment, a constitutional amendment, Clinton compromised. Clinton instead passed the Defense of Marriage Act. Now, he didn't push for it. Congress passed it. He signed it. And Congress passes it overwhelmingly. Just give you the numbers. It's not the most important thing to write down, but just understand how big this was. It passed 342 to 67 in the House. It passed 85 to 14 in the Senate. And of course, Clinton will sign it, a move that he will later regret, and it will kind of haunt Hillary when she decides to run for president. But again, it shows just this conservative backlash. But the good news for Clinton is 1996, despite the conservative backlash, despite the whole contract with America, Clinton was eager for re-election. And he had a couple things going for him. One is his people he's running against were Bob Dole and Ross Perot again. Basically, at this point, the economy is beginning to purr again. It's rebounded, and Clinton gets the credit. He easily wins re-election. He's quite popular by 1996. And during Clinton's second term, economists called it the new economy. This was the tech economy. This was the economy that was fueled by the rise in personal computers, the development of the internet. The stock market began to soar. And by 1998, unemployment was at a low of only 4.3%, the lowest in 30 years. And the world was becoming interconnected in so many ways. Now, again, I'm going to give you a personal story here. I remember this so well. I remember in 6th, 7th grade, this is earlier on, early 90s, I was enamored with it. We got a new computer at home with a Packard Bell with a CD-ROM drive. To me, that was the coolest thing ever. That was the height of technology, a CD-ROM to replace the old floppy disk. It was amazing. But then, by, my sophomore year of high school, so right about 1996, 97, I had a girlfriend. And she went to the school in the same county as me, different school, but she lived just outside the county limits. Her house was there. And so for me to call her was actually long distance. This is, pre-cell phone. And I remember my mother would only let me call her for 10 minutes a night because it was 10 cents a minute on AT&T, MCI, whatever the phone plan was. And I remember it was just a weird thing, like, oh, I'm sorry, I gotta go. I can't talk. My mom's telling me at 10 minutes because, phone bill, click. But just a year to year and a half later, things had changed drastically. It was just like a year or two later that I could suddenly plug in a phone line to my laptop or my desktop, turn on AOL dial-up internet. I could jump on a chat board and I could literally talk to someone across the world from South Africa, China, Japan, England for free in real time. It was most, you guys can't understand. I mean, you guys take it for granted now. It's just normal for you guys, but I remember the difference there. I couldn't call my girlfriend who lived in the next county, but now, just a year or two later, I could talk to someone in South Africa, Ecuador, Brazil for free. It was revolutionary. And all of this began to make a booming economy that was a more interconnected world. Unfortunately, though, all this came at a price. You see, American companies began to outsource all their labor. They began to downsize. Blue-collar labor lost ground to cheap foreign labor. and the labor union movement declined drastically. In other words, that giant sucking sound that Ross Perot warned about with NAFTA, it became a reality as all these companies moved their factories to Mexico and sometimes elsewhere as well. And so, although the economy did improve greatly, it was a booming time for our economy. Over the course of the 1990s, American manufacturing was gutted. And this region up here, the Midwest, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, this area right here, yep, that area became known as the Rust Belt. All these factories left, leaving behind rusted metal buildings, hollow, emptied out, as American workers lost their job to cheap foreign labor. Real wages declined as corporate profits soared. By moving their corporations and factories to Mexico, the factories, not the corporate, the factories to Mexico, and utilizing cheap Mexican labor south of the border, their profits soared at the expense of the middle class. And again, this is kind of important to understand because, what's happening today with the 2016 election. And while the economy should have made Bill Clinton a very popular president, and it did, you cannot not talk about Bill Clinton and talk about what he's most famous for: scandal. Specifically, Monica Lewinsky. His second term is consumed by scandal. Now, during his first term, there have been allegations. Let me give you the background here. So during Clinton's first term, there have been some allegations that Clinton had been improperly involved with what was called the Whitewater Development Company. This is back when he was Arkansas, still the governor of Arkansas. And so as Arkansas governor, he had invested in this Whitewater resort project, which turned out to be a fraud and a failure. And the Clintons took a big loss on their investment. Now, there was an independent counsel hired to investigate whether or not Clinton himself did something wrong here. Because remember, the company's a fraud and a failure. Well, during the course of the investigation, they didn't find he did anything wrong. But they did find that there was an allegation by a former Arkansas state employee by the name of Paula Jones that Clinton had sexually harassed her while he was governor. And so they began to investigate that claim. And of course, during the course of that investigation, it surfaced that Clinton may have had a sexual affair with a former White House intern, Monica Lewinsky, pictured in front of you. Of course, this would have happened while he was president. Now, is this illegal? Immoral? Okay, it's adultery. Is it wrong, sexual harassment? Obviously. But is having an affair illegal? And no, not legally speaking, as far as secular law goes. The illegal part came, though, that he may have pressured her to lie under oath about the affair to a grand jury. Now, that is perjury. That's also obstruction of justice. Having someone lie under oath to the governor, pressure someone to do so. So a president pressuring someone to lie to Congress, a grand jury, is illegal. It's obstruction and an impeachable offense. At least it was in the 1990s. And so, in 1998, he famously denied the allegations. In fact, let me give you the example of it right here. Assuming it loads for me.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
Now, while you might hope that's the end of the story, of course, it's not. Because shortly thereafter, he'll be called in before the grand jury to testify himself. And To his credit, he willingly goes before Congress and testifies openly, publicly openly, about his sexual, affairs. And the nation watched for 6 hours as Clinton was grilled and finally admitted to, quote, having, quote, inappropriate, intimate physical contact with Lewinsky. So let me repeat that, quote. He had, quote, inappropriate, intimate physical contact, unquote, with Monica Lewinsky. Now, I don't know how it's different than having adultery, but he's a lawyer. He spun it that way. And of course, that evening, Clinton delivered an address to the American people where he admitted to the affair, but insisted he did nothing illegal, i.e., asked her to lie. Now, the Republican-controlled House voted to impeach Clinton, the second president in history to actually be impeached, charging him with lying under oath and obstructing justice. Note, many of the same people in Congress in 1996 are still in Congress today, Republicans and some Democrats, who were involved in the Trump impeachment trial. And also interesting of note, Alan Dershowitz, who was a lawyer trying to prosecute Clinton back in 1996, then argued that obstruction was a crime that was impeachable. Of course, he has now changed that, and during the Trump trial, in which he says obstruction is actually not an impeachable offense. In fact, you don't have to have a crime, no crime at all. You can't really impeach a president. And of course, the crime ultimately here, I remember this very well. Most of the American public were most upset that the impeachment trial and his affair was dragging America's good name through the mud. Again, we still had this rosy image of America in the 90s, and we had a great economy. And most Americans were most outraged not by the lie part of it, not the obstruction part of it, but that as president, shouldn't a president have a higher standard as a leader of our country? Again, I remember talking to a lot of people as a young person. I was, a teenager, but that was the big deal. It wasn't even that he lied. It wasn't that the obstruction part. It was just that for the American, now that was the legal part, obviously, for why he's impeached. But for the American public, a lot of it was just simply because shouldn't the president, the leader of the free world, live to a higher standard? Maybe, maybe not. Nonetheless, he would be acquitted by the Senate, and thus he will not be removed from office. Now, there's two more issues at the end of the 90s that we need to talk about quickly, besides just Bill Clinton himself, though he'll be involved in these as well. The first one is immigration issues. In the late 90s, we begin to experience the changing face of America. And what we call this is the new immigration. Because since 1965, with the Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 65, since they had repealed those discriminatory immigration quotas, the United States was becoming much more diverse. And during the 80s, and especially the 90s, the US population grew by 20%, some 50 million people. But at the same time, almost 30% of Americans claimed some descendants or ancestry of African, Asian, Hispanic, or American Indian. 30% of the American population now claim ancestry of African, Asian, Hispanic, or American Indian. Blacks now represented 13% of the population, Hispanics 11%, Asians 4%, and Native Americans 1%. And I remember this very well. I remember being taught in school, within 15 years, whites will be the minority. And this became a big fear for a number of Americans. And this surge in both legal and illegal immigration produced a large nativist backlash. We'll see a large rise up of nativism, of egocentrism, and anti-immigration. Again, I remember this in school, being taught, oh yeah, within 10 or 15, maybe 20 years, that whites would be the minority. This scared the ever-living crap out of white Americans. And so the response was a very nativist response. For example, in California in 1994, California voters approved Proposition 187, which denied the state's estimated 4 million undocumented immigrants access to public schools, non-emergency health care, and other social services. In just 4 years later, 1998, California also ended bilingual education. And of course, we continue that trend to the present day where we had the issues out in Arizona where they could stop a person if they were suspected of being undocumented and ask for papers. Well, of course, it's going to be implemented racistly because who do you assume is undocumented? Someone of color. This has been a growing trend with this, again, this is a turn to conservatism. The other big turn to conservatism also occurred in our military, in our foreign policy. Remember, the Cold War is over. So over the course of the 1990s, we reached a kind of an ethical, moral quandary when it came to military and foreign affairs. Who are we now? The Cold War is over. What is our role in the world now? Because for more than half a century, since 1945, we have been this, global force for democracy and capitalism. But the Cold War is over in 1991. So, do we still believe that we should spread democracy across the world? Are we still containment? What is our role? And in the end, we still believe that our goal, our job as Americans, is to spread democracy, preserve democracy. And so we're going to see in the late 90s a number of foreign interventions that we will help overthrow the governments in Panama, Bosnia, Yugoslavia, Kosovo, all of which is going to stem some very staunch anti-American activity, anti-American hatred throughout parts of the world who resent us for involving ourselves in foreign nations, which of course will come back to haunt us in a couple of years with 9/11. But nonetheless, the 90s are ending, the economy is booming, and 2000 is a new election year. So the only question really is in 2000, which conservative party candidate will win? Republican or New Democrat? But until next time, bye-bye.